Good morning, folks. Welcome to Half and Half this morning. I am here in Blue Mountains and I'm happy to be here. We've been working our routine. A lot of our routine has some information about the upper body, but we want to talk about hip flexors a little bit today within that. Long ago, a few weeks back, we talked about ankles a fair amount and neck and kind of those two things together. I might bring up ankles again as we start talking about hip flexors. So first off, let's just say, like, what are your hip flexors? Maybe you've heard that term, maybe you haven't. If you notice, I keep taking my thumbs and putting them in my hip crease, right? And that is where my hip flexor muscles, some of my hip flexor muscles are. So this action right here, as I'm sitting, this is hip flexion. When I take the thigh and I make a fold, and the thigh bone and the hip bone have that flexion sort of coming together, that is hip flexion. So as I sit, I'm in hip flexion. As I stand, I'm in hip extension. So my hip flexor muscles help me create this action right here. So maybe you're aware of those muscles when you do different actions. Part of being aware of those muscles is a lot of times what we're aware of is lights off and lights at 1,000%, right? The hip flexors are on and they're screaming and working super, super hard, or we have no awareness of them at all. And what we want is to create maybe a little bit of a dimmer switch, that we want them to work in healthy ways. We want to be able to feel what it's like for them to work in healthy ways. We want to have a sense of when they can turn off or do less, and we want other muscles to come on. If I'm really trying to access my hamstrings or my abdominals, it's really useful to dim the hip flexor, right? So a lot of times you hear release your hip flexors, and that's fine, but it's not specific really, right? Maybe you hear that in hip flexion. Like maybe you're holding your leg up and somebody says release your hip flexor. Well, you don't want it to totally turn off, but you don't want it to be like shining super brightly, right? So we just kind of take that into the conversation. So sitting on your stool, if you have your stool or your chair, feet pretty much under your knees, but maybe heels pulled back a little bit. That's back to that ankle conversation, right? Getting nice, easy mobility in the ankles. And then in this position here, like I said, my hip is in flexion, but my feet are on the floor. So my hip flexors don't need to work in this position, really. Maybe a little bit to help me sit upright, but mostly everything's done passively. So that's step one. If you take your fingers and you touch that hip crease, is it popped way up? Are those muscles like jacked way up into your fingers? Or do you feel like you can get a little bit of like softening into that crease? And that the crease, the muscles kind of drop down towards the bone. So take your fingers, if you're not doing it already, and just kind of like needle around in that area of your body, maybe more towards the inner thigh part, maybe more towards the outer thigh part. There's a few different muscles that you could be contacting. Some of them are more towards the inner, and some of them are more towards the outer. So maybe that feels kind of malleable in there and kind of soft, or maybe it feels kind of rigid. Softness would be the goal, right? A little more softness in there. All right, once you have that, then we're going to try to feel that internally. So whether your eyes are closed or open, can you just take a couple breaths and imagine those muscles drip down towards the bone? Maybe they even drip through the bone to your sits bones, right? Just that kind of softening. And that softening might make the whole front of your thigh feel like it kind of spreads out as well, kind of a melty spread out feeling through the top of the thigh. So you just take that image, see what that's like. And then phase three, heels sink. You don't have to push. Sometimes if you push the heels, you actually turn those muscles on a lot. I just did it and I can feel them all come back on. So this easy, melty hip flexors, long tops of the thighs, and then heavy heels, which, if you remember, involves letting the front of the ankles release. All right, now we're going to take a little bit of movement in the pelvis. So the hips curl under, get a little longer in the front of the hips. The hips come forward, so you're towards the front edge of the hips, sits bones, more hip flexion. So round the pelvis, less hip flexion. Roll forward, kind of arch the pelvis, more hip flexion. And as you do this, because we're in a passive position, notice if there's a moment where that area locks and it feels like it's not kind of moving through that like in a juicy way, right? You can have juiciness in your tops of your thighs and your hip flexors through this whole process. And then settle into what feels like top of the sits bone. Again. All right, from here, we're going to take a little bit of our squatting, sitting and standing. So let's actually shift your weight forward a little. I have my hands on my knees and then back to sitting straight up. And then shifting from the pelvis, hip bones move towards the thigh bone. And then back up. So what happens there? Again, what we might get is a real deepening in that hip crease. That would be great. What we also might get is like a ballooning and lifting up and like tightening, something that prevents your movement. That would be less ideal. So as you shift forward, go to the place where you feel like you can really feel a crease and your heels can really ground, your ankles can release. And if you hit that kind of jarring, stopping hip flexor grip, then pause there. See if you can settle. Maybe you can go a little farther. All right, this time we're going to take it into standing, shifting all the way. Now full extension of the hips, lengthening of that spot. Crease, heels sink, ankles release towards your chair, and then back up, open the hip, and then crease the hip, and then open the hip. Now, you should not turn your hip flexors off in this movement. Now probably they need to support a little more. So that's all right. Maybe you feel your quads working. Better to feel more kind of center of the quad than stickiness here. So if I could be a little softer here and let the work be a little more really in the quad. The hamstring might come on a little more too as my heels drop. And then my belly might come on with all this, right? So how do we create integrated full movement as you go down and up? Maybe you make it all the way to touch the chair with your sits bones. Maybe you're not going that far. Release, 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 release. Open, open, open. Dimmer switch. And one more time. And get your strap. All right, so let's shift into some of that upper body work. We've worked with rotator cuff and neck, elbows wide, hands a little wider than your shoulders, knuckles pointing down. And then pull and release, and pull and release, and inhale, exhale, and inhale, and exhale. Now keep going. See if you could think of the heels again. Can the heels drop? Ankles are soft. And then maybe a little more sense of like long front of the thigh, long quads, open front of the hip, and pull out and hold it. All right, as you bend your knees, you're not going to tip your pelvis forward. So now we're just easy bend in the knees, more in the ankles than anything else. And straighten. And bend. This time lift the arms. Inhale, exhale. Now there's a little hip flexion going on here, but it shouldn't feel like a ton of work. It's pretty simple. So just a nice Easy, long feeling in the quads. And one more time up and release the tension. Maybe add a little lower belly connection. Inhale, pull. Lower belly work up to about like 20%. Not a big deal, just a little tone. 2 more, pulling out. Pull out and hold it, and bend your knees. Now one heel comes up. Stand on the right leg. Stand on both. Stand on the left leg and stand on both. And lift and lower and lift and lower. And inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Now take a look this time at what I'm not doing. I'm not doing send my pelvis forward and my butt back to flex my hip. Straight up and down as I go up and down. Lifting the heel, bend, straight down, just easy. Really open hip and both heels drop, right? And release and pull out. Inhale, reach. And exhale. Long open front of the hip. A little bit of support in the belly. Triceps, pull and release. Inhale, exhale. Heels keep sinking. One more time. And then bending the knees now up to a full balance, whatever that is for you, as your shoulder blades come together and apart and together and apart. So I'm taking my foot up to my knee, but you might just go up onto the toes. That can be your balance, some other version. Every time I straighten, I'm opening the front of the hip and all the way down. All right, let's put the strap off to the side. Now we're going to play with a little new movement today. It's not new. It's not a totally new movement, but new to our routine. So with Scott, you often do this psoas walk, right? Where you take this leg back behind. You'll probably do that today. That's again, this sort of hip extension on this one leg. We're going to add a feeling of that with a squat, right? So we're going to bend your knees a little and let's keep your body upright for now. So bending your knees a little and then just glide one foot back. So you're on your toes, right? Open front of one hip, a little bit of flexion in the other. But again, it doesn't need to be like lifting the heel and gripping the thigh. Heel stays down, ankle releases, hip releases. Bring it all back together. I'm going to turn the other way. We put the camera on the other side today. And bend. Opposite leg reaches back. Comes forward and straighten, right? So there's a little balance. Find your belly, bend, take one foot off, reach back together and straighten. Release your ankle. Send this knee forward. Keep dropping the heel. And up. And bend. Reach back. And together. And up. And one more time, bend. Reach back. Together. And up. All right, so abdominals are helping you with that balance. Now, phase 2. If you want to do phase 2, we add phase 2. If you want to stay in phase 1, you stay in phase 1. So you go bend, this time squat feeling, right? So it's a little harder to keep that deep feeling in the front of the hips. So I have my hands kind of on my knees, and then it's a little harder balance to be in that long diagonal and reach together. Open the pelvis. Flex at the hip. Long spine, reach back together and up. And heels stay heavy. Ankles release. And up. And bend. And reach. And back. And up. And one more time. Bend. Reach. and back and all the way up. Let all that go. We're going to add one more phase, but you can do phase one, you can do phase two, you can do phase three. Phase three is just to go a little lower. So for me, I'm going to go way down to touch my fingers to the floor. Helps that my arms are long. Lets me touch my fingers to the floor more easily. And then reach back and come together and back up. So up to you and maybe up to your knees a little bit. All the same things are true. Heels, ankles, hips, belly, balance, and forward. Reach back together and up and forward. Reach back together and up. One more each side. We've kind of been working on this in this plank movement we've been doing. It's very similar to how we've been working with that. And back up. Find your way to the floor. All right. Now, let's take a moment on our backs. And then after all that, how do things feel in your spine? How does it feel in your pelvis, in your knees, in your breath? And then maybe how does it feel in your hip flexors? I'll tell you how it feels in mine. Feels like they worked a little bit. It also feels like they're relaxed. So work, release. That's good for muscles. So it's not that they were totally relaxed in all those exercises. It's that they were juicy. They didn't just get stuck on the whole time. All right, let's take that lower abdominal feeling and just kind of carry some of that awareness as we go into knee folds. So little kind of soft work here. Using the belly more, thinking the crease of the hip doesn't get like stuck and gripped as one leg comes up and lowers back down. What's that movement like for you? And in this exercise, I'll remind you of the name, knee folds, right? So let the knee fold. Don't lift the foot way high. Knee folds. That'll make a difference in how the hips feel. One leg up, hold it there. Second leg up. Bring your knees together. Now let's take some form in the shins. Float the legs up so the shins are parallel to the floor. Do that from your belly. Now fold your knees again. Let the heels drop down. Try that whole thing again. Let the legs start to float up, supported from your belly, not just grabbing in your hips. Lower it back down. Let the knees really fold. My thighs aren't changing where they are in space, just my shins. And next time you have the legs up to that parallel to the floor place, supported from your belly, arms reach forward, ribs connected, leaving the head down, pumping the arms. Finding your abdominal support without holding the head up. Can you keep your neck relaxed? Head heavy, but abdominals working. Now, next 5, bring the head up if you want. Same work in the core. Now, if you want, you could start straightening the legs a little more, paying attention to that hip flexor place. What's it like for you? How straight do they get before the hip flexors lock down? I want to keep it in the belly. Bring it all back in and set your feet down on the floor. And then relax everything. All right, so let's go. Left leg extended on the floor. Leg extended means front of the hip is extended. Take your hand there to that place where the hip bone and the thigh bone, that meeting between those two places, right? And just like encourage it through your hand, maybe a little bit of like rubbing or circling, or maybe just imagery, just to have a little space there. Let the muscles lengthen a little, and then keep that feeling. Right leg floats in, knee fold, soft front of the hip. And as you start to extend up, only go to the place where the hip flexor is not histrionic, right? No histrionic hip flexors. Scott is very excited about what I just said, I can tell you. He likes alliteration, he likes the word histrionic. But that's the image, right? It's not that it has to be totally off in your hip flexor. Just still movable, right? Not crazy. Next time the leg goes up, leave it there. Support from your belly. Circle the leg. This is why we need the hip flexor to be movable, so we can actually move the leg. Supported from the belly in leg circles. Two more. Stay up for a moment. Put your hand on the back of your thigh if you want. Bend your knee all the way down again. Find it all again. Support your belly. Unfold your leg. Left hip extended. Other direction. Inhale, open. Exhale across in that. And relax your right leg all the way down. Let everything release. How does your right hip feel after doing that? For me, again, I can feel that it worked. And I can also feel that now it's relaxing. And I can also feel that my lower abdominals worked. Right leg straight out on the floor, left knee bent. Take your right hand and put it on the front of your thigh and just kind of make it juicy. Tenderize your thigh with your hand. Allow for that open, lengthened extension in the hip there. Left knee fold. First, just up and down. Little unfolding and then folding again. How high do you go? Just before the hip gets histrionic. Low belly supporting right away. Take it up, leave it there. And allow the hip to be movable as you circle across. Exhale around and up. Inhale across. Exhale, circle. One more. Short reset. Take your hand on the thigh, bend your knee down. Set it up again. Open. Exhale across it up. Inhale, open. Working your belly as you lift your leg. Deepen the crease in your hip. One more. Bend, relax, awareness. Just how's it feel? And bending one knee, bend the other knee. Find a way up to sitting. Let's come over onto your hands and knees. All right, so we've got the option of opposite arm and leg reach. We've done that one before. That's a good alternative to the plank if you want to do that. But we're going to just do a quick check-in with our plank. So hands under your shoulders, knees under your hips. Organize your upper body like you did with the strap. And then notice that hip flexion feeling. Pretty soft here. Even though your hip is in flexion, it's very passive. You don't really need to work the hip flexors to be here. Right foot reaches back. Feel the hip really extend, just like you did lying on your back. Left leg reaches back. Hip extends, just like you did lying on your back. Heels reach. Ankles soft. Low belly on. Right knee comes in. Left knee comes in. Move your pelvis a little. Left leg reaches, left hip extends. Right leg reaches, right hip extends. Heels reach. Ankles are soft. Lower belly supports. Left knee comes in. Right knee comes in. And coming off your hands. All right. I'm going to pass the torch in the form of an AirPod over to Scott.
Good morning, everybody. So you maybe noticed a little different angle today, those of you who join us weekly, because we have a construction zone on that other side of the room. So from a different side, different vantage point, let's start off in the sumo. So if you recall the sumo, step your feet wide apart, and then from your hip sockets, turn out a bit. Now you've been doing quite a few squats thus far where you're straight up and down. And today, let's go ahead and let there be a little bend in the hips. So it's a harmonious bend. Ankles contribute, knees contribute, hips contribute. And then come on up. Exhale, bend. Inhale, straighten. Now, while your torso does come forward, see if you can keep that dynamic alignment. Hips, abdomen, thorax, neck, and head. Rather than folding at your waist or pitching your head forward, keeping that harmonious alignment, what in some traditions is called the central channel of the body. So now next time you're in that triple flex position, let's pause there. Now place your shoulder blades snug up against your back. And you're going to know that you're doing that. There'll then be a sense that your chest has more breadth, more openness. And keeping your chest open, reach your arms back behind. And then take both heels up off the floor. We're going to challenge your balance a little bit. And slowly over a count of 5, descend your heels down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Contact. Push your feet down to come up. And then step your feet. And relax in standing. So we have a theme here today of releasing the hip flexors. And the more that you release those hip flexors and the length, the more you can stand up tall. But the association goes the other direction too. If there's a lot of tension in your neck and the base of the skull, there tends to be a lot of tension in the hip flexors. So to help release the base of the skull where the skull meets the neck, with your nose, make tiny little infinity signs. So as you do so, there's a little bit of your head going up and down, a little bit of your head going side to side. So let there be a quality of buoyancy to your skull, not glued to your neck, but almost a sense of floating atop your neck. And now the other direction. So little infinity sign. And let that movement attenuate. And as Colette prognosticated, we are going to do some psoas walk. Begin with your hands on your hips. Step your left foot a little bit back. And then lift your left heel to come forward. Descend that heel to go back. Inhale forward. Exhale back. Couple more. The next time that back heel is lifted up in the air, let's pause there. Then keeping your pelvis more or less where it is without arching your lower back. Reach your left heel back and down to create a little bit more length or openness in the front of the hip. Now, once that heel reaches the floor, bring your arms forward. And then from your left heel, reach your fingertips up. Let your chin float up too. To lengthen the entire front of your body. And then back to standing. Second side. Hands on your hips. Take your right foot back. Heel up. Heel down. Up. Down. Couple more. The next time that heel's lifted, let's pause there. Best you can, keep your pelvis where it is. Keep your lower back from arching as you telescope your right heel back and down. Careful not to land your heel on Ruthie Cat. Keeping that back heel rooted, arms forward, arms upward. Let your arms reach up and out of the back heel. And breathe. And then back to standing. All right. Now let's take in some respects, an unexpected approach to creating that length in the front of the hip. Begin by stepping your feet wide apart. Then turn your left foot in and your right foot out. And let's do a few bend and straighten. Right knee, exhale, bend. Right knee, inhale, straighten. So you might be wondering, what does this have to do with lengthening the hip flexor? Thus far, not much. Next time that right knee is bent, let's pause there. And then with the next exhale, tip your hips. Hand to knee, hand to hip, settle into the diagonal. So most likely you're watching a screen, and I imagine your nose faces the screen, your chest faces the screen, and to some extent your navel faces the screen. So see if you can keep that torso orientation toward your screen as you then rotate the back leg internally. And as you rotate that back leg internally, anchor the outside edge of the foot into the floor. Then from the rootedness of that back heel, bring your left arm forward and through, and a little turn to look up at your ceiling. All the while the back leg, rather than opening, rotates internally. Ride the next inhale up and turn back toward the front. Second side, right foot in, left foot out. Exhale, bend. Inhale, straighten. Now, for many years, I studied yoga, and my yoga instructors, pretty much to a person, said in these kind of positions that the back leg turns externally, which that has one set of benefits. But those benefits do not include releasing hip flexors, which for posture, back health, neck health, overall vitality, is among the short list of really important things to practice. So next time that left knee is in the bent position, let's pause there. Then tip your hips, let your torso, shoulders, neck, head follow. And then toward your screen, orienting your nose, chest, navel, and keeping that orientation as you rotate the back leg internally. Internal spiral. As you rotate that back leg internally, anchor the outside edge of that foot. And sweep your upper arm forward and through. And keep that back leg internally spiraling as you rotate a bit. Inhale up, turn back to the front, and then step your feet together. Root down to lift up. Let your head be buoyant atop your neck. And let's return to what I call Atlas axis liberation. Those are the two uppermost segments of the neck. Making that little infinity sign a couple times one direction, a few times the other direction. And let that movement trail off. Bring your hands to your hips. Take your left foot back. Lift that left heel up. Notice how your pelvis came forward. Best you can, keep your pelvis where it is without arching your lower back. Telescope your left heel back behind you and down toward the floor. Of course, your pelvis has to move back a little bit. As best you can, see if you can create length in the front of your hip. Then arms forward and upward, and breathe. Then back to standing. Second side, hands on your hips. Take your right foot back. Lift that right heel. Pause for a moment. Locate your pelvis. Check in with your lower back. And now telescope your right heel back and down. Then to create a little bit more length in the front of that right hip, arms forward, upward, float your chin up, and back to standing. Step your feet wide apart. Turn your left foot in and your right foot out. Exhale, bend. Pause there for the inhale. Exhale. A little further this time. Elbow to knee. Toward your screen, orienting your nose, chest, and navel. And maintaining that orientation as you spiral the back leg internally. You're at the outside edge of the foot as you sweep the arm forward and through. And take a little peek at the ceiling. Come on up. Back to the front. Right foot in. Left foot out. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. Mhm. Take a moment to orient toward your screen. If you haven't already, spiral the back leg in. And then sweep that arm forward and through. And a little turn. Inhale up. Back to the front. And then step your feet together. So let's make our way to the floor. Start with an inhale, inflate your back ribs. Then with the exhale, as your front ribs go down to the floor, sweep your arms up. Then with the inhale, roll your spine down from your head to your tail. And then let your head hang. Your hands can either be on your shins or the floor. And then with the exhale, reach the crown of your head forward. See if you can generate most of the movement, not in your neck, but right between the shoulder blades. And then step your feet back. Back to yoga pose, head down dog. We'll take a few breaths here. And then come on down to your knees. And back to your back. The shoulder bridge is one of the classic ways to create length in the front of the hips. Remember, those hip flexors are so strongly tied into posture. So start by pressing your lower back into the floor. And maybe you already noticed that as you press your lower back into the floor, your pelvis tips backward. That's what's called a posterior pelvic tilt. Let's hold here for a few more breaths in that posterior pelvic tilt. And now relax the effort to press your spine down. Feel how your pelvis returns to neutral. So that return to neutral is an anterior tilt. Let's do another posterior pelvic tilt. Press your lower back into the floor. Keep pressing. Keep that pressing. Now let your pelvis move from posterior tilt back to neutral. Now, another posterior pelvic tilt. And now as you maintain that posterior pelvic tilt, lift your pelvis. Now what happens for a lot of people as they lift up, they lose the posterior tilt of the pelvis because the hip flexors are tight. Then maintain that posterior pelvic tilt as you lower down. So to help release the hip flexors, the price of admission is to posteriorly tilt the pelvis before you lift up into the bridge. And as you lift up into the bridge, which becomes progressively harder to do. The higher you go, the harder it is. So let's do a few of these movements together. Posterior pelvic tilt to lift up. Maintain the posterior pelvic tilt as you roll down. And then once your pelvis is down, then release that tilt. Not like we want to walk around with the pelvis tilted in that extreme way. So it's really just for this particular exercise here. Lengthening the fronts of the hips. Maybe you feel the quadriceps lengthening too. And let's do one more up and down. All right. Now, let's continue this thread of releasing the fronts of the hips, lengthening the hip flexors, moving onto your belly. Let's start off with forehead on hands, what in yoga is sometimes called the crocodile. And in the crocodile, reach back through your toes to create a sense that your lower back is lengthening. Then as best you can, keep that length in your lower back. Take your right leg and lift it a little bit up off the floor. And then bring it back down. Keeping that length in your lower back, now lift your left leg up, not very high, just a fraction of an inch or so. And bring it back down. Right leg again, up. Straight leg lifts. And down. Left leg up. And down. Now I bet you can see this one coming. Stretch back through both feet, through the toes. Keep your lower back long. As you now lift both legs up. Lengthening the fronts of your hips, holding for a count of 3, 2, 1. Lower your legs down. Bring your hands by your shoulders. And then to help build strength, push up onto hands and knees. And from hands and knees to yoga pose, head down dog. Few breaths here. And then come on down. So take a seat. So it could be on the floor, could be on a cushion. Could be on the stool or the chair. All the way full circle. So remember that conversation. Drop your thigh bone. So in sitting, to some extent, the hip flexors have to work. Otherwise, you tip over backward. What's the quality of how they work? Are they holding on for dear life? Are they gripping, grabbing? So I'll oftentimes think when I'm sitting about letting my thigh bone drop. And in the last few months, I ditched my office chair that had a back on it and transitioned to doing all my desk work, all my office work while sitting on a stool. But then every minute that I spend working at my desk, which is many minutes per day, trains posture. But periodically when I work, I'll find my thighs hiking up. It's an old habit, it's an old tension pattern. So then I imagine those thigh bones dropping down, dropping down. Let's take a few moments here quietly, exploring in whatever seated position you may be in, rather than thigh bones tensing up. What's it feel like as they drop down? All right, that's our time for the day. So sometimes we have questions, comments that come in via the chat. Take some time for those if there's anything. Doesn't look like it. Well, thanks so much for being with us. We do this every Saturday, and except for the Saturdays when we're traveling, and it's free. So please let your friends, relatives, neighbors, associates, coworkers, maybe even your enemies, let them know, and we can all come together and work with our minds and our bodies. Bye bye.